The airplane buzzed with activity as passengers settled into their seats, some stowing their luggage while others flipped through in-flight magazines. Among them was a young woman named Sophie Lane. She was in her late 20s, dressed casually in a soft gray jacket and dark jeans, carrying only a small bag. As she walked down the aisle, her eyes scanned the Aurora Air first-class cabin. It had been a long day, and this flight was her chance to finally unwind. Sophie reached her seat, a window spot in first class, and sank into the plush chair, letting out a quiet sigh of relief. Work had consumed her life lately, and this trip was a rare moment to breathe. As she adjusted herself, she caught a few glances from nearby passengers. Some seemed mildly curious about her youthful presence in first class, while others barely acknowledged her. Sophie offered a polite smile and turned toward the window, her relaxed demeanor standing out in a section where passengers often dressed to impress. But Sophie had never been one to care about appearances. Comfort always came first. She wasn't looking for attention. She wasn't here to make a statement. She just wanted a peaceful flight. Just as she was settling in, Sophie sensed a pair of eyes on her. A flight attendant was making her way toward her seat. She was tall, in her mid-30s, with a confident stride and an air of strict professionalism. Her name tag read Mara Whitman. With her crisp uniform and sharply tied hair, Mara gave off the impression of someone who followed rules to the letter. As Mara approached, her gaze flickered over Sophie, scanning her from head to toe. There was something in her expression, a fleeting moment of judgment, subtle yet unmistakable. Sophie noticed but brushed it off. People made assumptions all the time. Mara stopped beside her row, her voice cutting through the soft murmur of the cabin. "Excuse me, miss," she said, her tone carrying more authority than Sophie expected. "May I see your boarding pass?" Sophie turned, slightly surprised but unbothered. She offered a small smile before reaching into her bag. She had placed her ticket right at the top for easy access. "Of course," she replied, handing it over. "Here you go." Mara took the ticket but didn't immediately move on. Instead, she held it for an extra beat, flipping it over, scanning the details as if searching for something out of place. Sophie leaned back in her seat, waiting patiently. Flight attendants had their procedures, and she understood that. But as seconds ticked by, Mara's scrutiny didn't waver. Her expression remained unreadable, but there was something about the way she studied the ticket that made Sophie's unease stir. Then Mara lifted an eyebrow. "Are you sure this is your seat?" she asked, her voice edged with doubt. "This is first class." Sophie's brow furrowed slightly. There was something about the way Mara said it, like she was questioning whether Sophie belonged there. "Yes, I'm sure," Sophie answered, her voice steady but polite. "I booked this ticket weeks ago. My reservation is confirmed." Mara didn't immediately reply. She simply stood there, eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to piece something together. Sophie could tell something was off. Mara wasn't just checking a seat assignment. There was something else. Was it the way she looked? Was it the way she dressed? After a long pause, Mara cleared her throat and straightened her posture. "I'll just verify something with the front desk. Please remain seated." Her tone had softened slightly, but there was still a thread of impatience woven into her words. Sophie nodded, though the discomfort in her gut deepened. She glanced around, but the other passengers were too absorbed in their own affairs to notice the tension. Mara turned sharply on her heel and walked briskly toward the curtain that separated first class from the galley. Sophie sat still, her mind racing. What was this about? Why did it feel like Mara was treating her as though she didn't belong? She had paid for this seat like everyone else. She had every right to be there. Minutes passed before Mara returned. But when she did, something had shifted. The crisp authority she carried earlier had wavered. She still held herself professionally, but there was hesitation now. An air of discomfort. Sophie could sense it immediately. Something had changed. Mara's smile was tight, forced as she turned back to Sophie. Her voice carried an odd mix of politeness and tension, an attempt to maintain control over a situation that clearly made her uneasy. "Miss Lane, I'm afraid there's been a small issue with your reservation," she said carefully. "I'll need you to step aside for a moment while we sort it out." Sophie's stomach tensed. This no longer felt like a routine check. Her instincts told her that Mara wasn't just following protocol. This was something else, something personal. But Sophie kept her voice steady. "What kind of issue?" she asked, refusing to let any irritation slip through. Mara straightened her posture. "I just need to verify something with the system," she replied, her tone clipped. "Please follow me to the galley." For a brief moment, Sophie hesitated. Around her, the murmur of the first-class cabin continued, but she could feel the shift. People were watching now. Some whispered to their seatmates, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Others glanced her way, then quickly looked away, as if afraid to get involved. Sophie exhaled slowly and stood. Whatever this was, she wasn't going to let herself be dragged into something unjustified. As she followed Mara down the aisle, she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. It wasn't just about her ticket anymore. There was something deeper at play. Mara's insistence, the subtle judgment in her gaze, the way she held herself as if she had already decided something about Sophie before ever speaking to her. The galley was a stark contrast to the cabin, smaller, quieter. The steady hum of the plane's engines filled the space as Mara led her toward the service counter. "Wait here," Mara instructed, then turned sharply, walking over to a phone mounted on the wall. Sophie folded her arms, watching as Mara's back stiffened. She could hear the edge in her voice as she spoke. "Yes, I have a situation here," Mara said, keeping her voice low but urgent. "I need confirmation on a first-class reservation. There's a passenger whose ticket might not be valid." Sophie's brow furrowed. Not valid? Her fingers clenched slightly at her sides. This was ridiculous. She had booked this ticket weeks ago. She had checked in. She had every right to be in that seat. So what exactly was Mara trying to prove? Mara's conversation dragged on longer than it should have, and Sophie could feel the glances from the other flight attendants in the galley. One of them, a younger woman with a softer expression, looked at Sophie, her eyes holding something close to sympathy. She seemed hesitant, as if she wanted to say something, but ultimately she stayed quiet. Sophie wondered if she should speak up, demand an explanation, but she decided to wait. If this was some kind of mistake, it would be corrected soon enough. Finally, Mara hung up the phone. Her face was slightly flushed now, her shoulders more rigid than before. Whatever she had just heard on the other end of the line had clearly thrown her off balance. She turned to Sophie, her expression colder than before. The polite act now completely stripped away. "I'm sorry for the delay," she said, though the words lacked sincerity. "It seems there's been a mistake. I'll need you to move to the main cabin. Your reservation doesn't match our system's records for first class." Sophie felt the words hit her like a wave of cold water. For a moment, she just stood there, frozen. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice quieter now, but sharp. Mara's gaze flickered downward as if avoiding direct confrontation. "I need you to move to economy while we sort this out," she repeated. The murmur from first class had followed them here. Sophie could hear passengers in the distance, whispering, sensing the tension even if they didn't fully understand what was happening. Sophie took a slow breath, steadying herself. "No." Mara blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "I said no," Sophie repeated, her tone unwavering. "I booked this seat. I paid for it. I am not moving." Mara's fingers twitched slightly at her sides. It was clear she hadn't expected pushback. Sophie could see it now. This wasn't just about a system error. This was about something else. Something Mara wasn't saying. And Sophie was about to find out exactly what it was. Sophie didn't move. She stood her ground, her gaze locked on Mara's, her patience wearing thin. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't just a mistake. It was something deeper. "I've been flying with Aurora Air for years," Sophie said, her voice steady but firm. "My reservation is valid. I'm in the seat I paid for, so tell me, what exactly is the problem?" Mara hesitated. The slight falter in her expression told Sophie that she hadn't expected this level of resistance. The other flight attendants had taken notice, and in the first-class cabin, the soft hum of murmuring passengers grew louder. The air had changed. This was no longer just about a seat. Sophie's heart pounded, but she refused to show even a flicker of uncertainty. She had dealt with situations like this before. People underestimating her, assuming she didn't belong, but she wasn't about to let that happen now. Before Mara could answer, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, his tone calm but commanding. Ladies and gentlemen, we kindly ask that you remain seated as we finalize some adjustments. Thank you for your cooperation. The announcement did little to ease the tension. Sophie noticed the way Mara's face paled slightly as she turned away, muttering under her breath. Without another word, she disappeared behind the curtain leading back to the galley, her steps quicker than before. Sophie remained where she was, her frustration mounting. She glanced out the small window in the galley, trying to steady herself, but the steady hum of the engines only made her feel more trapped. What is going on here? It wasn't just about an error. It was the way Mara had handled it, the way she had looked at Sophie, the way she had made her feel like she didn't belong, and Sophie couldn't understand why. Minutes stretched on in silence, the low chatter of first-class passengers filtering through the walls. But Sophie's mind wasn't calm. She could feel the weight of every passing second. Was Mara stalling? Was this some kind of test? Sophie had always preferred to stay under the radar, never drawing unnecessary attention to herself. But in a place like first class, where wealth and privilege were expected, she had already stood out simply by existing. She wasn't here to prove anything. She just wanted a quiet flight. So why was she being singled out? Finally Mara returned, but she no longer carried herself with the same authority as before. Her confidence had cracked, replaced by something else. Uncertainty. Her face was flushed, her eyes avoiding Sophie's, and her grip on the boarding pass in her hand was just a little too tight. Sophie noticed the shift immediately. Had Mara realized she'd made a mistake? For the first time, Sophie felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this ridiculous situation would be resolved. But then Mara spoke, and her voice had a sharp edge that didn't match her discomfort. "I'm afraid I still need to ask you to move." Sophie's jaw clenched. "Why?" Mara squared her shoulders, regaining some of her previous authority. "Your reservation has been flagged in the system," she said, pausing as if choosing her words carefully. "Until we resolve the issue, I need you to move to the main cabin." Sophie inhaled slowly, controlling her frustration. "Flagged?" she repeated. "My ticket is confirmed. If there was an issue, it should have been handled before I even boarded this plane." Mara shifted uncomfortably but didn't back down. "I understand, but it's protocol. I'm just following procedure." Sophie stared at her. This wasn't about protocol. This wasn't about a system error. This was about the way Mara had looked at her. The assumptions she had made. The quiet but undeniable message that Sophie didn't belong in this seat. But Sophie wasn't about to let her get away with it. Her voice was calm but cold. "Are you serious?" she asked, letting the weight of her words settle between them. "This isn't just a misunderstanding anymore. This is about how you've treated me from the moment I sat down." Mara blinked, but Sophie wasn't finished. "I don't know why you're doing this, but let me make one thing clear," she said, her tone unwavering. "This is my seat, I paid for it, and I am not moving." A flicker of hesitation passed over Mara's face. Sophie saw it. She knew she had just shifted the balance of power, and she wasn't letting it go. Mara flinched, her composure cracking for the first time since the confrontation had begun. Sophie saw the hesitation in her eyes, the flicker of doubt that hadn't been there before. Mara's lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but she quickly shut them, her shoulders tightening. The tension in the galley was suffocating. The moment stretched, thick with unspoken words. Just as Mara opened her mouth to respond, a voice cut through the silence. "Excuse me." It came from behind Sophie, deep, firm, and laced with quiet authority. She turned, finding herself face to face with an older man who had been watching from a seat near the galley. He appeared to be in his late 50s, dressed in a tailored navy blazer, his silver-streaked hair neatly combed back. There was something about him, an air of experience, of someone used to being listened to. His gaze settled on Mara, steady and expectant. "What's going on here?" he asked. "That's a paying customer in a first-class seat. Why is she being treated this way?" Sophie felt a wave of relief at the unexpected support. Mara stiffened, her hands twitching slightly at her sides. She looked down for a second, as if searching for an escape from the moment. Sophie could feel it, the weight of Mara's choices pressing down on her now. For the first time, it seemed like she was beginning to realize just how much attention this situation had drawn. "I'm sorry," Mara stammered, shifting uncomfortably. Her eyes flickered from Sophie to the man, then back again. I was just following protocol. There was an issue with her ticket, and I needed to confirm. Her ticket is fine. The man's voice cut through Mara's excuse like a blade. It wasn't aggressive, but it was unwavering. I saw it myself. I've traveled for years, and I've never seen a first-class passenger treated like this. His tone sharpened. So what's the real issue here? Mara opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Sophie watched as the flight attendant faltered, clearly grasping for a response. But there was nothing she could say that would justify what had just unfolded. And the rest of the first-class cabin knew it. The quiet hum of conversation had grown louder. Passengers were no longer just sneaking glances, they were openly watching. A few whispered to one another, their uncertainty shifting into something closer to suspicion. The power in the room had shifted. This was no longer just an interaction between a flight attendant and a passenger. It was a public reckoning. Sophie turned back to Mara, her voice quiet but firm. "Listen," she said. "I don't know what your issue is with me, but whatever it is, you need to handle it in a way that doesn't humiliate me in front of everyone." Mara's jaw tightened, her expression unreadable. Before she could speak, a sharp beep came from the phone mounted on the wall. The timing was almost eerie, an undeniable signal that she was out of time. Sophie saw Mara's shoulders drop slightly, the tension in her posture shifting from defiance to something closer to apprehension. For a brief second, Sophie thought Mara might apologize, but instead she turned away, her face pale, and hurried back toward the phone. Sophie remained where she was, arms crossed, refusing to let herself be moved by the silent pressure in the room. She watched as Mara lifted the receiver with slightly unsteady hands. This wasn't just about an administrative mix-up. This was something personal, and whatever it was, Sophie was about to find out. Mara finally ended the call, turning back to Sophie with a look that was no longer composed. The icy confidence she had carried just moments ago had melted into something far more uncertain. For the first time, she was no longer in control of the situation. And Sophie knew it. She had taken back the power, and she wasn't about to let it go. Mara swallowed, clearing her throat as if trying to regain her composure. But when she spoke, her voice wavered. "I'm sorry, but it seems there's been a mistake. Your reservation was flagged. I need you to move to the main cabin, just for now, until we sort this out." Sophie felt her pulse quicken, but she didn't let a single ounce of emotion show. She wasn't going to back down. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. This was about respect, about the quiet but clear assumption that she didn't belong in first class, that because she was young, she wasn't worthy of the luxury that came with it. Sophie stepped forward, locking eyes with Mara, her voice low but unshakable. "Mara?" Mara flinched slightly, as if hearing her own name spoken with such certainty startled her. "I paid for this seat," Sophie continued, her tone cool but edged with quiet authority. "My reservation is valid, and I'm not going anywhere." Mara's lips parted, as if she was about to protest, but no words came out. Sophie wasn't done. "Why don't you check again?" she said, her voice even but firm. "You'll see that everything is in order, and maybe, just maybe, you'll realize that making assumptions about people based on their appearance or age isn't just unprofessional, it's wrong." The flicker of realization in Mara's eyes was impossible to miss. She wasn't just dealing with any passenger. She was dealing with someone who refused to be dismissed, someone who wasn't afraid to call out injustice when she saw it. The other flight attendants were watching now. They had noticed the way Mara's posture stiffened, the way she gripped the boarding pass just a little too tightly. The whispers in first class had grown louder. The passengers weren't just glancing anymore, they were openly observing. The pressure in the air was thick, and Mara knew it. For a brief moment, Sophie thought Mara might finally apologize, but instead the flight attendant turned sharply and walked back to the phone. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the receiver again. This time, Sophie could tell, Mara wasn't just calling the front desk, she was calling someone higher up. The atmosphere in the galley shifted once more, an almost tangible tension settling into the space. The other flight attendants exchanged uncertain glances, watching Mara closely. Sophie stood her ground, unwavering. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just a seating mistake anymore. Something had triggered Mara's actions, and Sophie was going to find out what. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Sophie didn't move. She simply waited, letting the silence and the pressure build. Every second felt longer than the last. She knew the truth was coming. She didn't know what it was yet, but she was ready for it. Finally, Mara ended the call, and Sophie could see it immediately. Something had changed. The weight of the situation had settled fully onto Mara's shoulders. Her face had gone pale, her once confident posture now rigid with uncertainty. Her gaze lifted slowly, finally meeting Sophie's, but there was no authority left in it, only hesitation. Then, in a small, almost reluctant voice, she spoke. "Miss Lane, I'm terribly sorry for the inconvenience. There seems to have been a mistake on my part." Sophie froze. The words hit her like a thunderclap. Miss Lane? She had never mentioned her last name, and yet Mara suddenly knew exactly who she was. Sophie's mind clicked the pieces together in an instant. Mara wasn't just apologizing for a mix-up. She had just realized who Sophie really was. She had no idea that the quiet, unassuming woman she had been trying to remove from first class was Sophie Lane, the owner of Aurora Air. And now, everything had changed. Sophie felt the shift in the air before Mara even spoke. The realization had sunk in. The woman who had spent the last 20 minutes scrutinizing her, doubting her, and treating her as if she didn't belong, was now standing in front of Sophie Lane, owner of Aurora Air. The color drained from Mara's face. The forced authority in her voice had vanished, replaced by something far more uncertain. I didn't realize," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Miss Lane, She swallowed hard, her usual confidence crumbling. "I had no idea who you were. I'm so sorry. I just assumed." Sophie took a slow step forward, her expression calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. Mara flinched at the movement, as if she were bracing for impact. "Assumed?" Sophie repeated, her voice quiet but sharp enough to cut through the tension in the galley. "That's the problem, Mara. You assumed." Mara's eyes flickered downward, unable to hold Sophie's gaze. She was trapped, exposed for making a judgment based purely on perception. "Was it my age?" Sophie asked, her tone controlled but firm. "The way I'm dressed? Did I not look like the type of person who sits in first class?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Mara didn't answer. She didn't have to. Sophie could see it all over her face. The regret, the embarrassment, the realization that she had made a mistake too big to undo. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. Passengers were watching. The other flight attendants were frozen in place, their discomfort obvious. No one wanted to meet Sophie's gaze. Even Richard Calloway, the older man who had spoken up earlier, had gone silent, his arms crossed as he observed the moment unfold with quiet intensity. Mara finally broke the silence, her voice shaking. I didn't mean to offend you," she said hurriedly. "I was just following protocol. I thought there was an issue with your ticket, and when I looked at you, She stopped mid-sentence, her own words catching in her throat. She realized, in real time, how weak her justification sounded. Sophie let the silence hang, waiting. Mara swallowed and lowered her gaze. "I shouldn't have assumed anything." Sophie nodded, but there was no relief in her expression. "No, you shouldn't have." Her voice was calm, but it carried weight. "And you should have treated me with the same respect you offer every first-class passenger, whether they're young, old, rich, or someone you think doesn't belong." Mara's shoulders slumped, her posture reflecting the defeat in her voice. I understand." The soft hum of the engines was the only sound filling the heavy silence in the galley. The other flight attendants seemed to shrink back, unsure whether they should intervene or stay out of it. The murmurs from the first-class cabin had grown louder. Everyone knew something was happening, and everyone was waiting to see how it would end. Mara's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say more, to explain herself, to fix what had already been shattered. But there was nothing she could say that would erase what had just happened. Instead, she settled for a weak attempt at damage control. "I'll make sure this doesn't happen again," she murmured. I'll go get the captain." But Sophie wasn't done. "Wait." Mara froze in place. Sophie's voice was sharp but steady. "You're not going anywhere, not until we've sorted this out." Mara turned back slowly, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and guilt. "Fix it," she repeated softly. Sophie took another step forward, keeping her voice unwavering. "Yes, You're going to fix this. Right now. Not just for me, but for everyone who witnessed what you did. She gestured subtly toward the first-class cabin. You made a mistake, Mara. You treated me like I didn't belong here. You humiliated me in front of an entire cabin of people. And I don't take that lightly. Mara swallowed hard. Her shoulders sagged, as if the weight of the moment had finally crushed whatever pride she had left. I understand, she said quietly, barely audible over the hum of the plane's engines. I'll get the captain. Sophie didn't respond. She simply watched as Mara turned and walked toward the front of the plane, disappearing behind the curtain. As the moments passed, Sophie felt the eyes of the passengers on her. Some looked away quickly when she met their gaze, while others gave her subtle nods of support. But Sophie wasn't concerned with their reactions. She was still trying to process what had just happened. Never in her life had she imagined that a simple flight would turn into this. Judged, scrutinized, humiliated in front of an entire cabin. And for what? Because she didn't look like someone who belonged in first class? Sophie clenched her jaw, inhaling deeply to steady herself. Now that Mara knew who she was, what would happen next? Would she get a genuine apology, or would the airline try to sweep this entire incident under the rug? One thing was certain, Sophie wasn't going to let this go. Because this wasn't just about her. This was about every person who had ever been treated as if they didn't belong. The seconds ticked by, but Sophie's mind was sharp, focused. She had spent years building her career. She had poured everything into this airline. And she wasn't about to let one flight attendant's bias define the values of Aurora Air. She was going to make sure of that. Sophie wasn't just standing up for herself anymore. She was standing up for every passenger who had ever been judged, dismissed, or made to feel like they didn't belong. Mara returned shortly, but this time, she wasn't alone. A tall man followed closely behind her, his neatly pressed uniform and composed demeanor making it clear that he was the one in charge. His name tag read Captain Jonathan Reeves. He stepped into the galley, his eyes immediately scanning the situation, assessing Sophie first, then Mara. His expression hardened. "Miss Lane," he said, his voice steady and authoritative. "I deeply apologize for this misunderstanding. Mara has made a grave error in judgment." Sophie nodded slowly. Her voice remained controlled, but there was no mistaking the firm edge in it. "This isn't just about a misunderstanding, Captain," she said. "This is about respect." Mara shifted uncomfortably beside him, staring at the floor. "She assumed things about me," Sophie continued, her tone unwavering. "And that's something I'm not going to let slide." The captain's jaw tightened slightly. He looked between Sophie and Mara, clearly uncomfortable with the weight of the conversation. "We will handle this internally, Miss Lane. I assure you this won't happen again," he said carefully. "Mara will receive the appropriate training, and we will review our policies to make sure this type of situation never occurs again." Sophie narrowed her eyes slightly. Empty promises. She had heard them before. Training? That was the easy solution. A corporate bandage to cover the deeper issue at play. But Sophie wasn't looking for a temporary fix. She wanted real change. "Training is fine," she said, her voice measured, "but it's not enough." The captain exhaled through his nose, nodding slightly. "I understand." Sophie wasn't convinced. "This needs to go beyond one incident," she pressed. "It's about creating an environment where no passenger, whether they're sitting in first class or economy, ever feels like they're being judged based on appearances or assumptions." The captain held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded again, this time with more certainty. "I'll personally ensure that we take immediate action." Sophie studied him. She wasn't sure if she believed him yet, but for now, she had made her point. She let the silence settle before speaking again. "Good." For the first time since the confrontation began, Mara looked up. There was no trace of the confident, authoritative flight attendant Sophie had first encountered. Instead, there was something closer to regret in her expression. But regret wasn't enough. Mara had made a choice, and now she had to live with it. Sophie turned without another word and walked past them, stepping back into the first-class cabin. As she made her way to her seat, she could feel the atmosphere had changed. Passengers had been watching the situation unfold, and now, whispers spread through the cabin. Some looked at her with quiet admiration, others with curiosity, unsure of what to make of the moment. But she didn't care what they thought. She had won. Not in the way that called for applause or grand gestures, but in a way that mattered. She had stood her ground. She had refused to be dismissed, refused to be pushed aside simply because someone else had decided she didn't belong. A strange sense of calm washed over her as she reached her seat. The confrontation, the tension, the weight of the moment, it was starting to feel like a distant memory, even though she knew it wasn't over yet. She glanced around the cabin as she sat down, her fingers lightly gripping the armrest. Some passengers avoided her gaze, others offered subtle nods of approval. Then, Sophie's eyes landed on Richard Calloway. The older man who had spoken up for her earlier was still watching, his expression unreadable. But when their gazes met, he gave her a small, knowing nod, a silent acknowledgement. Sophie returned the gesture, the corner of her lips lifting in a subtle, appreciative smile. She didn't need applause, she didn't need validation. But the quiet understanding from those who had witnessed it all? That meant something. As the flight attendants resumed their duties, Sophie noticed a distinct shift. Mara, once confident and in control, now moved through the cabin differently. More careful, more hesitant. She avoided Sophie's gaze entirely. It was clear she knew she had made a mistake. A big one. And she couldn't take it back. The captain, too, had returned to his duties, but Sophie knew the conversation in the galley hadn't been forgotten. She could feel it. The wheels were already turning, the consequences of Mara's actions reaching further than just this flight. This wasn't something that could be brushed aside. Sophie knew that as soon as the plane landed, there would be questions. Conversations behind closed doors, policy reviews. Because this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about the kind of culture Aurora Air was building. Sophie exhaled slowly, turning toward the window. The clouds stretched endlessly below as the plane soared higher into the sky. She wasn't the type to seek out confrontation. But today had been different. She hadn't planned for it. She hadn't expected it. Yet something about the way Mara had treated her had struck a chord so deep that she couldn't let it go. Not just for herself, but for everyone else who had ever felt judged before they had even spoken a word. She wasn't going to let this slide. And she wasn't going to let anyone else be made to feel small simply because of who they were or how they looked. As she settled into her seat, she turned her attention back to the cabin. Richard Calloway still watched her from across the aisle, the hint of a smile in his eyes. She smiled back. The moment had shifted something. And Sophie Lane knew. This was just the beginning. Sophie sat back in her seat, staring out at the clouds. But her mind wasn't on the view. She had won this battle, but the war wasn't over. Captain Reeves had promised action, but Sophie never took words at face value. Especially when it came to something as important as changing company culture. She wasn't about to let empty promises pacify her. If this was truly going to be a turning point, she needed to see tangible results. Aurora Air had a long-standing reputation for exceptional service, and she had built that reputation with her own hands. But today's events had exposed something deeper, something rotten beneath the surface. This wasn't just about one flight attendant making a bad judgment call. This was about systemic bias. It was about the subtle, unspoken rules that dictated who looked like they belonged and who didn't. It was about the assumptions people made before they even bothered to learn the truth. And Sophie wasn't going to let it slide. With a slow, steady breath, she pulled out her phone and opened her email. A dozen unread messages filled her inbox. Some from business partners, others from her executive team. Normally she would have gone through them immediately, but today something more urgent required her attention. Her fingers moved across the screen as she typed a direct message to her assistant. Subject: Immediate review, training and protocols. We need to schedule a full review of our employee training programs, particularly on unconscious bias and customer interactions. What happened today on Flight 1724 was unacceptable. This cannot be treated as an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a larger issue. Draft a proposal for a mandatory company-wide training update and have it on my desk by tomorrow. Also, I want a full report on all prior customer service complaints in the past 2 years, especially those concerning discrimination or misconduct. We are not sweeping this under the rug. Let's get to work. She read the message over once, then hit send. It wasn't enough to react, she had to lead. This needed to be a catalyst for change, and Sophie would personally see to it that it wasn't just a temporary fix to save face. If her employees couldn't uphold the core values of Aurora Air, then they didn't belong in the company at all. She refused to allow bias, conscious or unconscious, to define the way her airline treated anyone. She put her phone down for a moment, closing her eyes. The steady hum of the plane filled the silence around her, but she could still feel the ripple effect of what had happened today. This was already bigger than just this flight. A soft vibration against her armrest pulled her from her thoughts. Another notification. Her phone buzzed again, then again. Sophie frowned, unlocking her screen. A stream of new messages appeared from friends and colleagues, some from within Aurora Air, others from her broader network. Just heard what happened on your flight. Are you okay? People are already talking about it. It's spreading fast. This is going to get a lot of attention. Let me know how I can support you. Sophie exhaled slowly. She wasn't surprised. News traveled fast, especially within the industry. People paid attention when something like this happened, especially when it happened to someone in her position. She could already sense the storm quietly brewing, and she wasn't afraid of it. In fact, she was ready for it. This wasn't about one mistake by one employee. It was about the deep-rooted issues that still existed within the airline industry and beyond. Sophie had spent years building her career, fighting to earn her place. She had broken barriers, defied expectations, and proven time and time again that she belonged. And yet, even now, she had been treated like an outsider. Like someone who needed to prove she was worthy of sitting in first class. If she had been treated this way, someone with power, resources, and influence, then how many others had suffered the same treatment without the ability to fight back? That thought made her blood simmer. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every passenger who had ever been judged unfairly, for every person who had ever been made to feel small, for everyone who had been treated differently simply because of their age, race, gender, or appearance. And if the very people she had trusted to uphold Aurora Air's mission couldn't live up to its values, then it was time to make real changes. As the plane began its descent, Sophie straightened in her seat. The city lights twinkled below, a breathtaking view that she barely noticed. She wasn't thinking about the destination. She was thinking about what came next. Aurora Air was her company, and she was about to make sure it truly reflected her vision. The landing was smooth, but Sophie could feel her pulse quicken as the wheels hit the ground. The journey wasn't over. Not even close. She glanced toward the front of the cabin. Mara stood near the exit, speaking quietly with another flight attendant. Her posture was stiff, her movements uncertain. She knew she had made a mistake. She knew she had crossed a line. And Sophie knew that she would never forget this moment. The passengers around her unbuckled their seatbelts, their voices a mixture of hushed conversations and the usual post-flight chatter. But Sophie's mind was still in overdrive, piecing together the events of the day, strategizing what came next. She wasn't the type to make waves without purpose, but today had been different. Today she had been forced into the spotlight, and she wasn't going to waste the opportunity. This wasn't just about one flight, this was about changing the culture of an entire industry. She reached for her bag and stood, her movements slow, deliberate. As she made her way toward the exit, she caught sight of Richard Calloway. The older man gave her a small, knowing nod, a silent acknowledgement of the stand she had taken. Sophie returned the gesture, her lips curving into the slightest smile. She didn't need applause. She didn't need validation. She just needed results. And she was about to make damn sure she got them. Mara stood near the front of the cabin, her posture stiff, her hands clenched at her sides. The reality of what had just happened was finally sinking in, and there was no escaping it now. She had made a huge mistake, and she knew it. The other flight attendants were exchanging uneasy glances, whispering under their breath, careful not to be too obvious. But Sophie could feel it. The silent judgment, the shock of what had just unfolded. They had all watched Mara unravel in real time. They had all seen her arrogance turn to fear, her authority crumble the moment she realized who she had been dealing with. And now, there was no going back. But Sophie wasn't thinking about Mara anymore. She wasn't thinking about the whispers or the stolen glances. She was thinking about what came next. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her expression unreadable. It was a message from her assistant. Internal review in progress. HR is drafting new protocols. Legal wants a call ASAP. This is bigger than we thought. Sophie's jaw tightened. She had already put things into motion, a full review of the airline's employee training programs. But now it was clear that this incident wasn't going to stay confined to one flight. This was about to become much, much bigger. Because once the media got wind of it, the floodgates would open. And then, the real question wouldn't be whether the airline would address the problem. It would be how far-reaching the consequences would be. As Sophie read the message, she felt the presence of someone approaching. Captain Jonathan Reeves was making his way toward the cabin door, pausing to shake hands with a few of the passengers as they disembarked. His usual professional demeanor remained intact, but Sophie didn't miss the slight tension in his shoulders. He had just witnessed something he wasn't going to forget. She stepped forward, catching his attention just as he reached her. She didn't need to say much. Her presence alone carried the weight of the conversation they had earlier. But she still spoke. "I hope you're taking this seriously," Sophie said, her voice calm but firm. "This isn't just about one flight attendant's mistake. This is about a deeper problem that needs to be fixed." The captain met her gaze. "I understand, Miss Lane," he said, his face grim. "We're already initiating an internal review. I'll make sure this issue is handled the way it should be. You have my word." Sophie didn't respond immediately. She simply held his gaze for a moment, her expression unreadable. Words were meaningless without action. She had seen too many executives promise change, only for things to remain the same. Not this time. Finally, she gave him a slow nod, her meaning clear. She would be watching. With that final thought, she turned and walked off the plane, her steps deliberate, steady. She had been a passenger when she boarded this flight. Now, she was something else entirely. She was the woman who was about to lead the charge for reform. The terminal was bustling with people, but Sophie barely noticed the noise, the movement, the announcements over the intercom. For a brief moment, she let herself blend into the crowd. But she knew something had changed. She wasn't just another traveler anymore. She was the spark that was about to ignite something far bigger than this flight. She pulled out her phone again, her fingers moving swiftly as she typed a message to her legal team. "I want an official inquiry opened immediately. This isn't just personal. It's a direct violation of the values we claim to uphold. I want a report on my desk first thing tomorrow. No delays." She hit send. There was no waiting, no sweeping this under the rug. The moment she stepped into that boardroom, this issue would be at the top of the agenda. And it wasn't going away until she said so. Sophie's phone buzzed again. Another message from her assistant. "HR is reviewing all customer-facing training materials. Bias training is being re-evaluated." But this is just the beginning. Sophie already knew that. She wasn't looking for a quick fix. She was looking for real, systemic change. As she walked toward baggage claim, she noticed a few passengers from her flight. A woman who had been seated a few rows behind her caught her eye and gave her a subtle nod. Others glanced at her as she passed, their faces a mix of curiosity and admiration. They had all seen what had happened. And they all knew this wasn't just about Sophie. This was about something much bigger. For too long, bias and discrimination had been quietly ignored in industries that should have been held to higher standards. For too long, people had been treated differently based on nothing more than how they looked, how young they were, how they dressed, how someone perceived their status. Sophie was done with it. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was a symbol. And soon, the entire industry was going to know it. She had fought too hard to build this airline into something respectable. And now, she was about to make sure it actually lived up to the standards she had set. Sophie Lane was far from finished. This was only the beginning. As Sophie made her way toward the exit of the airport, she could feel the undeniable shift in energy around her. The passengers who had remained silent during the confrontation earlier now seemed different, more engaged, more aware. Some gave her quiet nods as she passed, an unspoken acknowledgement of what had transpired. Others were already taking action. She caught glimpses of phone screens displaying emails, social media posts, and messages, passengers demanding accountability from Aurora Air. It was clear now. People were tired of being treated unfairly based on assumptions, and they were ready to stand with her. Sophie's phone buzzed as she reached the baggage claim. She barely glanced at the caller ID before answering. "Update me." Her assistant's voice came through, steady but laced with urgency. "Legal is already drafting statements. HR is reviewing all employee training materials, and we've received several customer service complaints within the past year that raise similar concerns." Sophie exhaled sharply, gripping the phone tighter. So this wasn't an isolated incident. She knew it, and now she had the proof. "I don't want just a training update," she said, her voice firm. "I want a full-scale review of our customer service policies, not just the scripts they follow, but the actual culture we've created. I need to know if this problem runs deeper than I think." "Understood. I'll start compiling reports." "Also," Sophie added, stepping outside into the crisp evening air, "tell legal I want to speak with them first thing in the morning. No waiting." Her assistant hesitated. "Are you sure? This is moving fast." "It needs to." There was no room for hesitation. The airline had one chance to do this right, and Sophie wasn't about to let them waste it. She ended the call and stepped into her car, closing the door behind her. For the first time in what felt like hours, she let out a long, steady breath. She hadn't even realized she'd been holding it. As the driver pulled onto the road, she stared out the window, watching the city lights blur past. Her mind wouldn't stop racing. This was just the beginning. Fighting for systemic change wasn't something that happened overnight. It was going to take time, effort, and unwavering dedication. But Sophie Lane was ready for it. The weight of responsibility. The drive home felt longer than usual. The hum of the engine barely registered as Sophie replayed the events of the day. The tension in the air was still palpable. Even though she had successfully stood her ground, she knew the real fight was just beginning. This wasn't going to be just a PR crisis to manage. This was personal. Sophie had built Aurora Air from the ground up. She had fought for its success, worked to make it a brand people could trust, and yet, today, she had been treated as if she didn't belong in the very company she had helped create. That wasn't just an inconvenience. That was a betrayal of everything she had worked for. Her phone buzzed again, snapping her out of her thoughts. A message from her assistant. "HR is prioritizing bias training. But you were right. We need transparency. People are already asking questions." Sophie tightened her grip on the phone. Fast action wasn't enough. She needed real, measurable results. It wasn't about appearing to do the right thing. It was about actually fixing the problem. As the car slowed in front of her home, her phone vibrated again. This time, it wasn't her assistant. It was social media. The story was already spreading. Passengers from the flight were posting about what had happened. Some were calling out Mara's behavior. Others were questioning Aurora Air's corporate culture. Sophie had expected this. What she hadn't expected was the sheer volume of support already forming. People weren't just upset. They were eager for accountability. She scrolled through a few posts, absorbing the growing momentum. This wasn't just about her experience. This was about a movement. People wanted change. And they were willing to stand behind her to make it happen. Sophie felt a small but significant wave of relief. This wasn't a fight she had to take on alone. She stepped out of the car, pushing the door shut behind her. The cool night air hit her skin, but she barely noticed as she walked inside, her mind still turning. She tossed her keys on the table and made her way into the living room. Celeste was sitting on the couch, phone in hand, scrolling through what Sophie could only assume was the same online conversation that had been lighting up her notifications. When Sophie entered, Celeste looked up, her expression calm but questioning. "How was the flight?" Her voice was measured, careful. She already knew something had happened. Sophie sank into the chair beside her, leaning back, exhaling. "I didn't expect it to escalate like this." Celeste studied her for a moment. "But it did." Sophie nodded, running a hand through her hair. "And now we have to make sure it doesn't just fade into the background." "You're not going to let it, are you?" Celeste's voice held no doubt. Sophie shook her head. "Not a chance." The next few days would be critical. She would need to hold her team, her executives, and herself accountable. She would need to make sure that Aurora Air didn't just react to the problem, but fundamentally change the way it operated. The weight of responsibility pressed against her, but she didn't let it overwhelm her. If there was one thing Sophie Lane knew how to do, it was lead. And she wasn't just leading a company anymore. She was leading a movement. This wasn't just about fixing one employee's mistake. This was about changing the future of the industry. And Sophie was ready to fight for it. Celeste's voice was soft but firm. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" Sophie met her gaze, her expression resolute. "No," she said without hesitation, "I can't." This was no longer just about her experience. It was about every person who had ever been judged unfairly for no reason. Every passenger who had sat there wondering why they were being treated differently. She paused, exhaling slowly as the weight of it all settled deeper. Her eyes darkened with determination. "It's time to do something about it." Sophie leaned forward, elbows on her knees. "We're going to make sure this issue doesn't get buried. Not this time." The next few days were a whirlwind. Sophie barely had time to breathe, let alone rest. She was pulled into back-to-back meetings, non-stop calls, and an endless stream of emails, all focused on the fallout of what had happened on Flight 1724. Her legal team was already on top of things, preparing for potential lawsuits and public scrutiny. HR was scrambling to review existing training programs, but Sophie had made it clear this wasn't just about tweaking a few policies. This was about fundamentally changing the way Aurora Air operated. And then, of course, there was the media. The story had gone public faster than she had anticipated. Headlines began popping up everywhere. Aurora Air faces backlash after first-class passenger confronts flight attendant's bias. Owner of Aurora Air calls for airline-wide reform after onboard incident. Corporate bias in the skies? Passengers speak out. Sophie had known this would happen. She had prepared for it. But knowing it was coming and actually experiencing the full force of it were two different things. There was no turning back now. The public was demanding answers, and Sophie knew this was her moment to make an impact. But as much as she wanted to dive headfirst into fixing everything, part of her struggled under the sheer weight of responsibility. She had always worked tirelessly to build Aurora Air, to shape its values, to make sure it was a company that stood for something. Now, the spotlight was on her. And this wasn't just a business crisis. This was a movement. Sophie sat in her office, scrolling through messages from her executive team. A notification popped up from one of her senior leaders. "Drafting a public statement now. We'll acknowledge the incident and commit to change." Sophie sighed. Acknowledgement wasn't enough. She wasn't going to release some empty PR statement filled with vague corporate apologies. Words were easy. Action was hard. She quickly pulled up the draft and scanned it. Too soft, too polished, too safe. She grabbed her pen and began making edits immediately. More transparency about how they were going to address bias in the company. A clear timeline of action, not just vague promises. A commitment to a full-scale review of hiring, training, and customer interactions. When she was finished, the document no longer felt like a corporate response. It felt like a declaration of change. It wasn't going to be easy. Sophie knew that. Some people inside the company would resist the changes. Others would question her motives. But that didn't matter. She had made up her mind. This wasn't just about patching things up. This was about creating a new standard for the airline industry. Celeste had been her anchor through all of it. They had stayed up late every night discussing the future of Aurora Air, trying to make sense of the storm they were now navigating. And it wasn't easy, because this was bigger than just Sophie. This wasn't just about one flight attendant's mistake. This was about the culture that allowed that mistake to happen in the first place. One evening, as Sophie sat at the kitchen table reviewing another round of proposals, Celeste leaned against the counter, watching her. "Do you think they'll actually follow through?" Celeste asked, her voice quiet but pointed. Sophie didn't look up from her screen. "I don't know." She set her pen down, finally meeting Celeste's gaze. "But I'm not giving them a choice." Her voice was steady, unwavering. "If they don't follow through, they'll regret it, and I'll make sure they do." Celeste studied her for a moment, then gave a soft smile. "I know you will." The pressure intensifies. By the following morning, Sophie was already drafting another email, this time to the board of directors. She wasn't asking them to make changes, she was telling them what needed to happen. Subject: immediate action plan. We are past the point of simple apologies. This is about real accountability. Effective immediately. I want third-party consultants brought in to evaluate and overhaul our hiring, training, and customer service policies. I want a public commitment, not just vague promises. If we don't lead this change, the industry will force it upon us. We have a choice. We can either set the standard, or we can fall behind. She hit send. This was only the beginning. The days that followed were a blur. Sophie spent every moment in meetings, reviewing policies, pushing for immediate action. The media frenzy only grew, with news outlets covering Aurora Air's response, or lack thereof. Sophie's name was now synonymous with the fight for change. Not just as a passenger who had been mistreated, but as the owner of the airline. Someone who could do something about it. And Sophie wasn't about to back down. Not now. Not ever. Sophie sifted through proposal after proposal, her eyes scanning every line of feedback from her legal and PR teams. She knew every word mattered. Public opinion was everything right now, and one misstep, one vague or insincere response, could jeopardize the company's entire reputation. This wasn't just about damage control. This was about leading real change. The response had to be swift. It had to be decisive. And it had to be more than just an apology. Sophie refused to put out some corporate statement filled with carefully crafted words designed to pacify the media. If they were going to say something, it had to come with action. She made her final edits, pushing for more transparency, accountability, and urgency. When she was satisfied, she gave her team the go-ahead. And then, they released it. Immediate impact. Within hours, the response was explosive. Headlines flooded news sites. Social media erupted with a mix of approval and skepticism. Aurora Air commits to major reform following controversial first-class incident. Real change or corporate lip service. Public weighs in on Aurora Air's promises. Suspended flight attendant at center of scandal. What happens next? Sophie read the reactions, analyzing the patterns. Some people praised the airline for taking responsibility. Others questioned whether these promises were just for show. Sophie understood their doubts. Words meant nothing if they weren't followed by real, measurable action. The official statement outlined a series of major reforms. Mandatory bias training for all employees. A full review of hiring and customer service policies. The introduction of a third-party audit to ensure real accountability. The suspension of the flight attendant involved, pending an internal investigation. On the surface, it was a strong first step. But Sophie wasn't interested in just first steps. She needed results. Celeste sat beside her, reading the statement over again. "It's a good start," she said, setting the paper down. "But you're right. This is just the beginning." Sophie nodded, her expression hard. "I won't let them stop here." She turned back to her laptop, already drafting her next set of demands. "We need to make sure this goes beyond words. The company needs to change. The culture needs to change, and I'm going to see that it does." As the days passed, the pressure only intensified. Media coverage didn't die down as quickly as Sophie had hoped. People were watching, waiting to see if Aurora Air would actually follow through. The hashtag airline accountability trended on social media for days. Customers, industry experts, even former employees of the airline, they all joined the conversation, demanding real, lasting reform. Sophie could feel the weight of it all. This wasn't just about fixing one incident. This was about changing the industry. Hands-on leadership. Sophie didn't trust anyone else to handle this the way it needed to be handled. She personally attended every meeting. She sat through every HR discussion. She reviewed every policy, every complaint, every training manual the company had used over the years. She made sure that everyone in leadership understood the stakes. Aurora Air had one chance to get this right. And if they failed, they wouldn't just be disappointing Sophie. They'd be facing a public reckoning. At first, the board of directors was hesitant. But under Sophie's relentless pressure, they began to shift. One afternoon, in a tense executive meeting, one of the board members finally broke the silence. "We've got to be willing to go further than just compliance." Heads turned toward him. "This can't just be about following regulations," he continued. We need to create a new culture. Sophie's lips pressed into a firm line. She met each person's gaze around the table, letting the weight of their words settle in. Exactly. She leaned forward, her voice unwavering. This isn't just about fixing a problem. It's about making sure this never happens again. We're going to set a new standard, and we'll be transparent about it every step of the way. The turning point. That evening, Sophie sat alone in her office, reflecting on how far they had come. Her phone buzzed, a message from her legal team. The third-party audit will begin within the next few days. Sophie stared at the message for a long moment. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The audit would examine every aspect of Aurora Air's internal structure: hiring practices, training protocols, customer service interactions, workplace culture. No stone would be left unturned. She exhaled slowly, setting her phone down. This wasn't going to be easy. The truth was, she knew the audit would uncover things she wouldn't like. It would expose deep flaws in the company she had built. But that was the point. They couldn't fix what they refused to face. And Sophie Lane was ready to face everything. Because this wasn't just about her. This was about every passenger who had ever been treated unfairly. Every employee who had ever felt unseen. Every industry leader who had looked the other way instead of addressing the problem. This was about setting a precedent. And Sophie wasn't going to rest until it was done. No more assumptions, no more bias, just fairness. The road ahead was long, but Sophie Lane was ready to lead the way. Sophie leaned back in her chair, staring at the report in front of her. The third-party audit had begun, and soon it would shine a light on the flaws that had allowed biases like the one she had personally experienced to go unchecked. But Sophie wasn't going to leave anything to chance. She made a mental note to reach out to the audit firm personally. She had spent too many years building Aurora Air's reputation to let it crumble over one incident. If they were going to fix this, it had to be thorough. No stone left unturned. And the results? They had to be public. Aurora Air's customers needed to know that these weren't just empty promises. Transparency was key. Sophie pulled out her notebook, jotting down points for her next round of meetings. But as she wrote, her mind drifted back to the passengers on that flight. The ones who had watched the confrontation unfold. The ones who had whispered amongst themselves. The ones who had silently sided with her. She hadn't forgotten their looks of quiet support. And now it seemed those same passengers were taking their own stand. She had seen their emails, their social media posts, their calls for accountability. They were the ones who had helped make this bigger. They were the reason Aurora Air couldn't just walk away from this. Sophie felt the realization hit her like a wave. This wasn't just her fight anymore. The entire industry was watching, and people were ready for change. She wasn't just here to fix one problem. She was about to lead the charge for a more inclusive, respectful airline industry as a whole. The weeks passed in a blur of emails, phone calls, and late-night strategy sessions. Every day brought new challenges, new obstacles. The pressure had only increased, but so had Sophie's resolve. She refused to let this become just another corporate apology that faded into the background. This was her moment to leave a real legacy, not just for Aurora Air, but for the entire industry. When the third-party audit officially started, Sophie was ready to face whatever truths it uncovered. She knew it wouldn't be easy. She knew it would expose uncomfortable facts about the company's past. But it was necessary, because this time, the changes they were making weren't just for optics. They were about building a future where every passenger, no matter who they were, where they came from, or how they looked, was treated with dignity and respect. And it wasn't just about passengers. It was about the employees, too. Sophie personally attended training sessions with the customer service teams, ensuring that the message was being delivered loud and clear. She didn't just want employees to understand the importance of respect and inclusion. She wanted them to live it. From first class to economy, every customer deserved to feel valued, and she would make sure they did. One afternoon, Sophie's phone rang. She glanced at the screen. Aurora Air PR team. This is it. She took a deep breath before answering. Tell me. A pause. Then the audit results are in. Her pulse quickened. She had been waiting for this moment. This was it. The truth. No more assumptions, no more speculation. Facts. As the meeting began, Sophie sat at the head of the table, her hands clasped. The lead auditor stood, holding the thick report in his hands. "I won't sugarcoat this," he began. "The findings are damning." Sophie nodded, already prepared for the worst. "Go on." The results were exactly what she had expected. Deep-rooted cultural issues that had allowed bias to go unchecked. Unconscious biases in hiring and training programs. Outdated customer service policies that left room for discrimination. A lack of diversity in leadership. Sophie listened in silence. She took in every word. When the auditor finished, the room fell quiet. Sophie exhaled. She had two choices. She could react or she could lead. Sophie stood. Her voice was calm but resolute. "We're not here to be defensive. We're here to fix it." She turned to her leadership team. "Starting now, every policy gets scrutinized. Every hiring decision gets reevaluated. This isn't just about what happened on that flight anymore." Her eyes moved across the table, locking on to each executive. "We're building a company where respect and inclusion aren't just talked about. They're ingrained in everything we do." Sophie wasted no time. She immediately scheduled a series of follow-up meetings with HR, legal, department heads. Every layer of the company was about to undergo a transformation. She knew the public eye was still watching. The media pressure was still there. But that didn't bother her, because Sophie wasn't doing this for the headlines. She was doing this because it was the right thing to do. No more excuses, just action. Sophie had come too far to turn back now. She would lead her company through this storm. She would ensure that Aurora Air became a true example of what was possible when accountability and progress went hand in hand. This was bigger than one flight, bigger than one incident. This was about creating lasting change. The aftermath of the audit. The days following the audit report were a whirlwind. Sophie moved at full speed, keeping an unrelenting pace. Endless meetings, constant updates, monitoring how each department was implementing the changes. She remained in constant communication with the teams overseeing the training programs. A sense of urgency ran through every conversation. This wasn't just a new initiative. This was a transformation. But it wasn't easy. Some employees resisted the changes. They were uncomfortable. Change always was. But Sophie was firm. "This is a company-wide effort," she told them in one of the all-staff meetings. Her voice was clear, uncompromising. "If we are truly committed to change, then every single one of us has to be on board. And if you're not, then you're not part of the future we're building." Slowly but surely, the culture began to shift. People started listening. Employees realized that this wasn't just about one passenger's experience. This was about making Aurora Air a company where everyone, regardless of who they were, felt valued. Sophie saw it in small but powerful ways. Employees started speaking up when they saw bias. Customer service teams took more time to understand passenger concerns. The leadership team held itself accountable in a way it never had before. This wasn't just talk, it was action. As the months passed, Aurora Air saw tangible results. Customer complaints about discrimination and poor service declined. Passenger feedback on inclusivity and respect soared. The employees who embraced the change became leaders, driving a new culture of accountability. For the first time, Sophie felt the momentum shift. They weren't just reacting anymore. They were building something new. One afternoon, Sophie stood in front of Aurora Air's boardroom. Looking around, she saw familiar faces, faces that had once hesitated, faces that had once pushed back. But now there was a new energy in the room. She took a breath, then spoke. "We've come a long way," she said. Her voice was steady, confident. "But we can't stop here. This company's commitment to respect and fairness will never stop." The board members nodded, some more eagerly than others, but they all knew the truth. Aurora Air had changed, and there was no going back. Later that day, Sophie stood by a massive window overlooking the runway. She watched as a fleet of Aurora airplanes took off, one after another, climbing into the sky. For the first time in a long time, she felt a deep sense of peace. The journey had been long. The fight had been hard. There had been challenges she hadn't anticipated. But it had been worth it. She had stood firm in her beliefs. She had pushed for change. She had held her company accountable. Sophie thought back to that day on the plane, the day Mara Whitman had judged her based on assumptions, and she smiled. Because this wasn't just about one flight. This wasn't just about one mistake. This was about creating something bigger. A movement. An airline where everyone could feel safe, valued, and respected, no matter where they sat. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. It never was. But Sophie was ready. She hadn't just rebuilt an airline. She had built a legacy. And as she watched the planes soar into the open sky, she knew the sky was never the limit.